Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our second show in our series of shows about the Sino-Japanese War. But as we found out yesterday, and as we will continue today, it's not just an isolated war. It has its reach and spread far across the world. And today we're talking about how Taiwan was involved in both the Sino-Japanese conflict and also the wider campaign in the Pacific. So I just was talking to my guest, and I'll introduce him in a minute. But one of the things I love about this show is bringing subjects that basically I know nothing about. I mean, I know a little bit about it. Obviously, things come up here and there, but I love bringing subjects to you, the viewers, that really are new. And this is quite an exciting day because my guest's book is out today, or the public access, open access version is open today. So there we are. So my guest, Seiji Shirane, is from the City College of New York. His new book, Imperial Gateway, is out today. The links to purchasing the book, that's the actual hard copy of it, is in the description below, and you can receive, using the code there, a 40% discount. It's also available open access, and we'll bring him in now. So good afternoon. How are you today?
Thank you very much for having me, Paul.
Thank you for being here. So before we get into this whole, as we'll find out in the presentation, quite complicated subject, because we've got to establish the kind of classification of what is a country and what is a colony and what is occupation and what is alliance, all these terms that we've introduced over World War II TV, things that on the surface sound quite simple. We've talked about neutrality in the past, but there's neutral and there's neutral, there's occupied and there's occupied. So before we get into that, just tell us a little about yourself and your background.
Sure. So my name is Seiji Shirane. I was born in Japan, but I grew up in New York City. So I'm a second generation Japanese American. My grandparents on both my mother and father's side, they were college age during World War II, did not go to the war fronts, but managed to stay alive and stay in Japan. My grandfather on the father's side came over to America in the 1950s for physics. Stayed over here. My father was born and later married my mother in Japan. So I'm in between an American and a Japanese. I studied history in college, and then I went and studied, taught English and learned Chinese in China for 3 years. So I went into graduate school at Princeton in 2008 with a focus on Sino-Japanese relations. I knew I wanted to work on relations between Japan and China. As your previous guest, I'm sure, talked about a lot about the so many of the occupations and battles. There was very little, of China that wasn't affected by Japan in the 30s and 40s. But during graduate school, I wanted to look at a new way, not just the Nanjing Massacre or occupation of Manchuria, northern China. And during my studies and collecting archive materials in Taiwan, I found that this would be a new way to study not just Taiwan's history, which is important in itself, but relations between Japan, China, and then non-Japanese subjects. What happens to the Han Taiwanese, the Indigenous Taiwanese? What roles do they play in China, Southeast Asia? And as you'll see in today's presentation, everyone knows about British American POWs and the sort of torture or the horror that they experienced under the Japanese, but there were Taiwanese, Koreans involved as well. And what do these second-class imperialists, but imperialists no less, what roles do they play? What are the effects on them, on Taiwan, and really all of East Asia and Southeast Asia, which you cannot understand without looking at the role of Taiwan from 1895 to 1945.
Brilliant. And I think we'll get into this during the presentation, but I think one of the things that's going to come up over these 2 weeks is that I feel that we're at the beginning really of understanding this conflict. I mean, obviously a lot have been written about in China and Japan, but for the wider world, I mean, there's certain things. I mean, I live in Normandy. I'm a Normandy historian. We've kind of done Normandy. We've been talking about Normandy globally for 80 years now. I feel for a lot of people watching that this is new subject for a lot of people, and there's a lot of work to do, and particularly bringing in the different voices. I mean, there have been Western books written about the conflict from a very Western lens, and there have been obviously local books, Chinese books from a Chinese lens. But people like yourself bringing it all together into a sort of a Louisiana kind of jambalaya of views, I think is the way forward, so we can get that multicultural aspect. But well, anyway, I'm rambling now. Let's bring up your PowerPoint and you'll be taking it through. So folks, I think because of the nature of the subject today, we'll hold off questions till the end, at least kind of the big ones. If there's something about what's up on screen, of course, fire away with comments. But I think mostly we'll do the quick Q&A at the end. But basically, over to my guests. So I'm looking forward to sit back and learn. So over to you.
So as you can see from the book cover, this is Imperial Gateway. Today it's available on Amazon Kindle, open access, etc. Paul also mentioned the links if you'd like a hard copy. The person with the armband on the right over here is a Han Taiwanese interpreter. He's bilingual in Japanese and Southern Chinese dialects, and he is interpreting on behalf of the Japanese soldiers you see in the middle, and then the Chinese POW with his hands tied behind his back. And so I chose this picture in 1940 occupied South China to signify and symbolize the mediation and the intermediary roles played by the Taiwanese, and how you can't look at Japanese-Chinese relations just by looking at ethnic Japanese and Chinese. There are different regional and ethnic actors involved, and how did this Taiwanese get in here on the battlefield and beyond? So just to give you a sense of the maps, in red is the island of Taiwan, and the picture over here is the colonial government, the Taiwan government general, which had military and civil jurisdiction over the island. Part of my book argues and shows the competition, debates, and inter-bureaucratic ties and rivalries. It's not just the Japanese Tokyo government, having this master plan expanding outward. The Army and Navy, Foreign Ministry in Tokyo, and then the Taiwan government general in Taipei, they had different competing visions. And how does that play out on the ground in pre-war and then wartime East Asia and Southeast Asia? We have similar parallels in India, for example, with the Indian government general and the Raj versus London. So for those of you who are new to Taiwan, it's a fascinating history because it has, experienced multiple colonialisms. There are books written on Dutch and Spanish colonial rule in the 17th century. The Sino-Japanese pirate named Ko Xinga, or Zheng Chenggong in Chinese, who kicked out the Dutch in the mid-1600s. Then Taiwan comes under Chinese imperial rule for the first time. No, not since time immemorial, but from 1683, rules it for over 200 years. And then Japan, in the first Sino-Japanese War, the first war they defeat China in 1895, they annex and cede Taiwan as part of the war bounty from China in 1895. And it is their first overseas and longest colonial territory for 50 years. After World War II, it returns to China, not the PRC that we know today in mainland China, Communist China, but the ROC, Republic of China, the Chinese nationalists, and they took over Taiwan. In the Q&A, we can talk about the legacies or what happens to, the remnants of Southern rule and Southern expansion. And the reason why I was able to publish this book and why this new history about using Taiwan as a center, it's really because since the democratic period in Taiwan, the lifting of martial law, it was taboo and forbidden to write and about the Japanese period in a non-Chinese nationalist way. But Taiwanese scholars in the 90s and 2000s have collected amazing Japanese and Chinese archival material. I've looked at their oral histories and really, as Paul said, tried to not only write my take on it, but introduce this fascinating scholarship in Taiwan and East Asia to the English language audience. So Taiwan, although it's seen as, part of East Asia, really geographically sits at the crossroads of East and Southeast Asia. And there can be many ethno-cultural, geographic arguments to be made for why it might be classified part of Southeast Asia. We know that Southeast Asia is a geographical construct that didn't really come into use until the 1940s. And who lived in Taiwan? Well, we have indigenous Austronesian Taiwanese peoples who inhabited the islands from 1,000 years ago. And from the 16 and 1700s, you have Han Taiwanese migrating from South China to Taiwan and inhabiting mainly the western part. So we have two ethnic groups that I'll be talking about, the Han and the indigenous Taiwanese. Now, to just, there have been hundreds of books written about the Japanese Empire. Taiwan's the first colony that Japan annexes, although people sometimes think that the Ryukyu Islands, later known as Okinawa, clearly they were also colonized. They were a kingdom. So there are technicalities of, why is an Okinawa considered a colony versus Taiwan? Well, the inhabitants in Okinawa eventually by the 20th century enjoyed the same education and citizenship rights as those in Japan, whereas in Taiwan, throughout the 50-year period, they would remain second class and not enjoy the same first class citizenship rights as those in Japan. Korea is then colonized in 1905, 1910, and so you can see that there's a northern expansion going in through Korea, and the army is really interested in Manchuria, northeast China, because of the Soviet threat. And the Navy is really interested in Taiwan. They were the ones really pushing to annex it in 1895, and then southward towards South China and Southeast Asia. So again, it's not a master plan of northern then southern. They're happening simultaneously, and there's contention between the Army and Navy, which we can talk about. China, formal China, northern China, is then invaded in 1937. You can see the yellow parts, and then coastal parts of South China will be invaded in 1938 to 45, and that's where Taiwan comes in the occupation of South China. And then with the Asia-Pacific War in 41, 42, with Pearl Harbor and onwards, Taiwan then becomes a key player in the Southeast Asia war front, which I'll talk about. So just like India has had its own imperial interests, ambitions in neighboring Middle East or African regions, the Japanese colonial officials in Taiwan were pushing for more economic military expansion into South China right away. So you cannot think of the Japanese as having a holistic, homogenous view or policy. Things that are going on in Korea are in competition with things that are going on in Taiwan, and vice versa. The big players, of course, in World War II are the Army and Navy, and oftentimes it's, why didn't the foreign ministry do more to prevent Japan from declaring total war in China? But we also have to look at the colonial governments and their roles in pre-war and wartime Taiwan. So the first half of my book really looks at initiatives that are taking place from Taiwan, not from Tokyo, but from Taiwan. Some of the inspiration parallels that I've drawn on are the role of India in what people call the Indian Ocean Arena. Thomas Metcalf, Sagata Bose, a lot of the new scholarship in Indian British history is looking at the role of British officials in India, how they're exporting laws, architecture, institutions, etc., in Kenya, in South Africa, in Malaya, as they're occupying these regions, and how many of these regions are becoming incorporated as part of the Greater Raj. And of course, there are millions of Indian laborers, soldiers later, that play a huge role in World War I and World War II, and we can talk about some of the differences and similarities. Also, in the French Mediterranean, in North Africa, we have French Algeria, and what are the roles of Algerians or French subjects playing in the gradual expansion into Tunisia, Morocco? So this idea, I title my book Imperial Gateway because of looking at Taiwan as a gateway, not just for Japanese, but then Taiwanese into neighboring regions. I think that aptly can, it's apt to describe Tunisia, Algeria, India as imperial gateways as well. So generally speaking, from the get-go, there are northern and southern multi-vectored imperial trajectories and multiple ways that Japan can go, right? Nothing is set in stone. A lot of it's improvisation, reactionary, and really what the Chinese and the Western powers are allowing the Japanese or reacting to. What that a lot of it is serendipitous.
And it already seems to me that the various players that we're not talking about so far, but Australia, the USA, the British Empire you touched on, is that these nations are all perceiving this area of the world through incredibly different viewpoints, and where the British, Hong Kong, perhaps is very important, Singapore, and we're looking at the same map, but it's like we're blinkered by the empire or the nationality of where we're coming from. And it's just fascinating to realize that Taiwan is a gateway from a point of view, and then other places are gateways from other points of view. And it's this thing we're always thought about this channel, is trying to see these same events from a slightly shifted angle, and therefore opening up so much more of the world to us. We have the same tools. The maps are the same, but it's how you look at those maps is so colored by who is showing you the map.
Oh, definitely. And so, if you're French at the turn of the 20th century, Indochina, Vietnam is a gateway.
Yeah.
The French are using Indochina to expand into Southwest China. British Hong Kong, British Malaya are the gateways for economic and military expansion. Shanghai, and then the U.S., which comes in quite late in 1898, the Philippines.
Yeah.
So really, and the Japanese in Taiwan, they're learning about the Philippines and Indochina and Hong Kong through Taiwan, because it's close, because these territories matter, because trade matters. And so if you're looking at it from Tokyo, from Taipei, from Manila, as you said, this history is endlessly fascinating, and there's so many layers depending on the regions that you're looking from.
Yeah.
So just like the British Indians are, second-class imperialists, they are colonized, but also doing the colonizing. My focus is on the Han and Indigenous Taiwanese. There's a fascinating field of Korean history and the role that Koreans play in Northeast China, North China. Generally speaking, what is it like to be a colonized imperialist, or a colonized colonizer, or intermediary? To try to step away and not look at Taiwanese subjects just as victims or victimizers. There's a whole range of roles and experiences, and to not, look at this in a black and white sense. So who are the Taiwanese? Today, people might think of Taiwanese as a de facto independent nation state trying to retain its independence against the PRC. I'm not using Taiwanese in a nationalistic or national category. I'm really using it as a legal and territorial category that the Japanese are using. So they take over Taiwan. There are about 3 million residents. And who are these residents? Well, the majority, 2.8 million, are ethnically Han Chinese. They've migrated from South China for a better life, for land, for trade. They are descendants and can speak the same language. Many of them still have family in South China. Then we have the Indigenous Taiwanese, indigenous peoples, Austronesians, which shares a lot with the rest of Southeast Asia. They have, gradually been marginalized by the Han Chinese colonizers, and they live in the mountainous parts of eastern Taiwan. So when I'm using the word Taiwanese for this presentation in the book, it's the political term of ethnic Han Chinese registered in Taiwan. They are legally colonial subjects. They are legally Japanese nationals with Japanese passports, but are second-class citizens. They're not equal. And then when I'm talking about overseas Taiwanese in South China and Southeast Asia, I'm talking about, again, these with legal Japanese nationality who are residing in China and Southeast Asia. But the overseas Taiwanese category gets blurry in a lot of the first half of my book. This is a table of contents. Sort of explains the trickiness of the Taiwanese category, because many of them are Chinese, and I'll explain what that means in a second. I won't go into the details of I started this project in 2010 as a dissertation and then revised it, using the Japanese colonial archives, which are available in Taiwan, Tokyo Archives, Army, Navy, Foreign Ministry in Tokyo, the Chinese materials I could get access to or that are published in mainland China, and then oral histories to really try to flesh out the biographical details that you can't see in the official archives, as well as British and American consular officials. They're very important because they're on the ground in South China observing, I wouldn't say neutrally, but they are third party explaining what's going on to the Japanese and Taiwanese. So it's a piecemeal of materials to try to get as many perspectives as possible. So again, the first half of the book, we talk when I'm talking about teaching China in my class, the phrase is the carving up of China. And China is fascinating because it is not a colonized territory really until most of northern and central China becomes occupied in 37. It is at best termed semi-colonial, or there's sort of informal imperial territories. Yes, Hong Kong has been a colony since 1842. Yes, Taiwan is a colony from 1895. But as you see from this map, there are more spheres of influence where the Japanese don't colonize the South, but they have advantages or priorities in terms of being able to build railways or have companies. But the French have that in southwest China, the British in central China, Germany in Qingdao and Shandong, etc., and then Russians northeast China. So you can't look at Sino-Japanese relations without looking at all the Western powers who are involved in wanting a piece of the pie in terms of the economic and strategic importance that China holds. So South China, the main treaty port cities of Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Shantou in South China, these are the ones that have major trade networks and channels with Taiwan. And after 1895, Japanese enjoy what's called extraterritorial rights. Americans, French, other Western powers do too, meaning they can live in these treaty port cities, and if they are exempt from Chinese law. Were they to commit a crime, etc., they would be tried by their own national courts. Right? Also, they're exempt from paying Chinese taxes. Now, you can see what the draw would be for some local Chinese to take on Japanese nationality. And this is where we get the interesting rise of the overseas Taiwanese in South China. You have tens of thousands of Taiwanese that begin to populate South China, and they are not all people migrating from Taiwan into South China. Rather, it's local Chinese merchants who want to be protected from Chinese law, who want to not have to pay Chinese taxes, to get Japanese legal and police protection. They apply and are then given Taiwanese subjecthood. So they are willingly becoming Taiwanese subjects. Right? And the Japanese are recruiting them because this is empire on the cheap. They don't have a lot of resources, especially in Taiwan. They're trying to put down rebellions. They don't have money to send Japanese and Taiwanese to South China. But if you have wealthy Chinese elites who are willing to become dual nationals, who might help you out economically, politically, why not bring them in? Interestingly, though, this is a time at the turn of the 20th century where the British and Americans are making it increasingly impossible to get American or British nationality if you are a Chinese ethnicity. There's anti-Chinese, immigration laws and bans. So the Japanese are using sort of a inclusive ethnic membership and allowing Chinese to become Taiwanese and Japanese at a time when Americans and British are not.
Well, I just find this fascinating because it's all this whole thing about identity and how someone would classify themselves and how officials might classify them and how the world might classify them as being entirely separate things. And as an Englishman who's also British, living in Europe, in France, I completely understand this idea about labels, and we're in a 2022. It's all about how people label themselves and pronouns, things like that. And I realize that the previous histories I've written about this, well, they're just the Taiwanese. It doesn't really mean anything. I mean, it does and it doesn't, but you've got to quantify it.
You can have a legal, identity with your passport, but in your day-to-day life, you still call yourself Chinese or you call yourself Japanese, and you could be multiple. And in fact, oftentimes it's not out of national loyalty, but what is going to be profitable, what is going
Yeah.
to protect your individual interests. And for the Japanese, they're saying, let's use this to our advantage. These Taiwanese in South China can be gateway intermediaries, precisely because they speak the same languages. They have the family and economic connections. So part two and the core of today's talk is going to be really the second half of the book, which is on the wartime period. And we talk about World War II in the West, but really in Japan and East Asia and Southeast Asia, it's two wars, right? The Second Sino-Japanese War, which really starts in 31, but is officially legally a war from 37 onwards. And then you have the Asia-Pacific War. So I tried to divide these up into two chapters, but they're going on at the same time. But from the Japanese and Taiwan perspective, these two wars are initially very different. And so I'll just talk about the Sino-Japanese one, which Paul's you know previous guest already I'm sure went over. I'm not going to talk about the major battles that people have probably heard about. In some, the Japanese are able to, within a year, take over the main cities and railways in North China and Central China. Everyone has probably heard about the Nanjing Massacre, the taking of the Chinese nationalist capital, Nanjing, hundreds of thousands dead, massacred. But really, by 38, the Navy and Army, they wished and hoped that Chiang Kai-shek would have come to a truce or a compromise and to surrender by 38. They wanted a quick war, not a long, bogged down war, because besides the railways and major cities, they cannot control all the countryside and the mountains and etc. So by 38, it's bogged down, and there's sort of a stalemate. The Japanese have already invested millions of troops in northern and central China. What is left is the South China and then southwestern parts of China, and that's where Taiwan comes in. Okay, now what happens to these tens of thousands of Taiwanese in South China when Japan invades China? Japan and China are at war. The Taiwanese are caught in between, right? Are they going to be seen as Japanese, seen as Chinese? And Chiang Kai-shek, to protect the main coastal cities in South China, he dispatches army troops to occupy South China, the main city being Xiamen in 37. And the Japanese consuls there, they order their residents to evacuate to Taiwan, and the majority do. Those who do not, though, are imprisoned or executed by the Chinese as Hanjian, or in Chinese, Han, Chinese traitors or Japanese spies. So you can already see the tensions that have been built up, that the Taiwanese are not to be trusted. They are working on behalf of Japan as spies. So what happens to Taiwan and South China during this wartime period? Well, while the Chinese are trying to, they talk about the Taiwanese as ruffians, running dogs, pro-Japanese spies, and are justifying their military crackdown on South China. The Japanese are using their own sort of propaganda campaign to potentially justify military occupation, saying, look, our overseas Taiwanese subjects are innocent and are being victimized, killed, arrested. We need to liberate and protect them. That's the reason why we need to set out from Taiwan and occupy South China. The Taiwan Governor General, the Japanese colonial leader at the time, Kobayashi Seizo, he's from the Navy, and he's a key ally with the Navy in promoting a military advance. And so the Navy and Army finally agree in 38, 39 to occupy South China. And much of it is to try to block the shipping and air lanes from Hong Kong, from Indochina, that are aiding Chiang Kai-shek in Southwest China. They're saying, if we don't occupy the coastal South China cities, we're not going to be able to block off this Western Allied aid. So they occupy Xiamen, Shandong, Guangzhou, Hainan. And this is where the Navy and Army turned to Taiwan and the Japanese government general for aid. They know that the Japanese officials in Taiwan have decades of experience, and they have the personnel, the languages to try to help restore order and administer these occupied cities. So the picture on the bottom right is the Japanese occupation of the port city Xiamen, where there were tens of thousands of Taiwanese. Initially, the Taiwan government general, this is one of the competing sort of agendas. They asked the Tokyo government, can South China be placed under the jurisdiction of Taiwan? Can Taiwan's responsibilities extend to South China and have a southern region's government general led by the Japanese officials in Taiwan? The Navy and Army in the end put a stop to that, but they still rely and turn to Taiwan and recruit thousands of Japanese and Taiwanese officials to then administer. So in the end, the Taiwan government general will play more of a cooperative role, not a directory role, but still nonetheless a critical role in the Navy and Army occupation. So the tens of thousands of Taiwanese come back to Xiamen. Many of them work in the police, work in the local sort of puppet or pro-Japanese Chinese government, work as teachers, interpreters, etc. So just to give you a little sort of more biographical and sort of color to this, I'll talk about the experience of these Taiwanese military assistants. So initially, the Japanese do not allow Taiwanese to enlist and become regular soldiers. The Japanese are worried that the Han Taiwanese are going to be loyal to China. They can't be trusted. So they allow Taiwanese to volunteer in civilian auxiliary assistant roles. Only in 1941-42 will Taiwanese be allowed to officially become soldiers. So in 37, they are going to be interpreters, policemen, prison guards, and as you see with the picture here, they're armed with swords, not with guns. But in reality, when they arrive in China, many of them are armed and fighting in the war front. So they are de facto military personnel. Now, why would the Taiwanese volunteer? And there are several explanations. One is the financial incentive and the upward social mobility. You can make 2, 3, 4 times the wages that you would work that you are making in Taiwan. Many of them, they thought, look, if we're eventually going to be drafted or enlisted, I'd rather go in a safer civilian position. And others, they've grown up in Taiwan. Their first language is Japanese. They are truly patriotic, loyal to the Japanese emperor, and they want to use this as an opportunity to serve their country, show that the Taiwanese are just as loyal, just as capable as the Japanese. You can see similarities in Japanese Americans. They're interned in America during World War II, but yet they go and fight in Europe or in the Pacific, and it is truly to try to show that they are just as American as the next. You even have examples of volunteer applications with a blood oath, meaning they cut open their hand and sign their volunteer applications to show that they're willing to shed blood to try to join the military. And you have tens of thousands of applications for only a few hundred positions. And this brings us back to the book cover of what some of the leading positions were Taiwanese interpreters. What were some of their experiences? So I bring up the example of Hu Xiande. He's a Navy interpreter from 1940 onwards. Now, people probably know this, but China has hundreds of dialects, right? And this is as if you had to know every language in Europe to understand all the languages in Europe. To be able to communicate with everyone in China, there are hundreds of dialects. So even the Taiwanese who speak the main Fujian or South Chinese dialect, they have to undergo Chinese dialects for Cantonese, for Hakka dialects, for Hainan dialects, just pretty much any region, right? Very quickly. Navy training, intelligence, propaganda, use of military weapons. Now, the case of Hainan is very fascinating. People when I visited in the early 2000s, Hainan is the biggest summer resort for Russians because it's this tropical island and there are beautiful beaches, and Russians frequently travel to Hainan. The Japanese wanted to turn this sort of pretty barren island that was not inhabited into a second Taiwan. And the idea of sending Taiwanese to Hainan is they're used to the tropical weather, used to the tropical diseases, and also can understand the dialects relatively quickly. So there are thousands of Taiwanese throughout South China helping out in ruling occupied South China. Now, what are the tensions that pop up? Of course, you can't generalize. There are some good Japanese-Taiwanese relations, but from the oral history of Hu, he talks about he's getting paid higher wages as an interpreter, and so he has lower ranking ethnic Japanese soldiers who resent him for what they think is unfair compensation, right? Also, many of his Japanese colleagues and superiors still look down on Taiwanese as Chinese, and are doubtful of their loyalty as a true Japanese, right? So they're caught in between. At the same time, they're the ones interfacing between the Chinese and Japanese. They're interpreting and administering, forced labor for Chinese POWs. So they also become the biggest targets of Chinese antipathy. They're the ones who can speak to the Chinese and interface. At times, they're using corporal punishment to get Chinese POWs or residents or soldiers to work for the Japanese. So you can see what the potentially devastating consequences will be after 1945 when Japan loses and what happens to these Taiwanese left in China.
Just to jump in, the parallels I'm thinking here is it seems that they're hedging their bets a little bit about how they treat the Taiwanese. They're on the one hand they're saying, well, you're not a proper military, you're not as good as us, but on the other hand, we want you to do these really important things. So you're going to be in some ways more. And I'm thinking about how the Germans, for example, in the Eastern Europe, kind of classified some of the territory where they said some of them, they kind of made them, well, you're going to have your own unit, you're special, you're going to have your own insignia, and they kind of installed pride. And others, it's like, yeah, you're nobodies, you're just slave labor. But it seems in this case that they're kind of gone for this mixture of the two, which is neither one thing or the other. That's my interpretation of it.
And really, if there were enough, let's say, ethnic Japanese soldiers, they were just so spread thin in North China, Central. They didn't have enough troops to maintain their positions in the rest of China. So this is a last, this is a second option for the Japanese. Why are they enlisting Taiwanese and Koreans? Well, we don't have enough Japanese, right? The Taiwanese and Koreans understand what's going on, but it's an opportunity for them. So Paul's absolutely correct. They could be beating and cursing the Taiwanese at the same time that they're saying, Taiwanese, this is your chance, serve your country.
Yeah, it's a very complex. I have to say you're explaining it really well, and that's the feedback in the sidebar is that you're taking a really complicated subject and making it easy to understand, which is fantastic, because we've talked about it so many times before, so many labels. We've talked about the confusion of the word colony, but I remember doing shows about the French resistance, and words like resistance and collaboration are so heavily loaded. You assume something when you hear that word, and colonies and lower class, these are all terms that when the military historian or history buff hears them, you put a classification on it, you make an assumption. And as you're explaining, it's never quite as simple as just the labels that they've been given. So yes. I'm enjoying it. So
so in the Sino-Japanese War case, there's a lot of inspiration from French Vichy and French collaboration studies to say, look, yes, the Chinese are calling anybody who works on behalf of Japan a collaborator. Instead, only Mao and those who fought against the Japanese were the heroic resistors and nationalist heroes. But of course, on the ground, these labels, just as Paul said, are much more complicated depending on which perspective. So where ethnicity and identity is even, more complicated is the example of Tai. So he's a policeman, a police official going to this tropical island of Hainan in 1943. And the policemen often serve, multiple roles as interpreters, uh, overseeing forced labor. And so he goes and he happily gets, 3 times the wages that he got working as a policeman in Taiwan. He sends those back to his family. He collects, translates Chinese military intelligence, what the CCP and ROC troops are doing, um, interrogates Chinese POWs. Now, of course, this is Tsai's oral testimonies in the 80s and 90s, and he's probably being a bit defensive to try to show that he's not just a cruel, horrible, heartless person. He's saying that, look, yes, he had to interrogate, torture, sometimes help execute these Chinese POWs. He says at times he advised Japanese commanders not to indiscriminately kill Chinese. He's also saying, look, this might be hindsight, but he says that he felt very conflicted because he did feel that he was a fellow ethnic Han Chinese, right? So he's saying, look, he admits to interrogating, executing, but not a day passed when I forgot that I was ethnically Han, and thus I did not willfully kill the Chinese. Now, in the Q&A, we can talk about agency. Taiwanese are not being forced to do this. Well, how much free choice and free will do they have? And that's a very tricky subject. But we do I did try to put as much of their oral testimonies in the book to give them a voice, which you often don't hear in the official archives. So then into the Asia Pacific War, with Pearl Harbor and the Japanese decision to fight a two-front war, which of course a lot of Japanese leaders, civilians, whether they were skeptical or supportive of it, this complicates things very quickly. A year into the war, this is the height of Japan's empire. Everything in purple is occupied by Japan. So if you really look at the map, at its, Japan is the size of California. It's quite small. At its most extensive, it's quite an expansive empire that they have. Now, the Japanese Army and Navy, they did not expect to oversee hundreds of thousands of Allied POWs so quickly. So this is where we have lots of books written about Allied POWs and some excellent ones that have come out recently. And this is where Koreans and Taiwanese also play a role. So Taiwanese are going in as interpreters, laborers, farmers, serve second class, but in supervisory positions. And why is that? Well, not just in China, but in Southeast Asia. Everyone knows that there are millions of migrant ethnic Chinese from South China. Some of the most wealthy and successful entrepreneurs are from South China. So these Taiwanese are doubly useful, not just in China. They can speak the same languages and share the same hometowns as many of these Southeast Asian Chinese in Singapore, in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies. Right? So there's a linguistic advantage. Secondly, the Japanese need men. If they're going to send ethnic Japanese to fight in the Pacific, they need the second class Taiwanese to work, as POW prison guards. And here's where the indigenous Taiwanese, who have not been part of our story yet, come to the forefront. And it's not a lot of them, but several thousand, an estimated 4,500 indigenous Austronesian Taiwanese are enlisted, and we'll explain why they would be useful in Southeast Asia. They were not deployed to South China, but they were seen as very useful in Southeast Asia. So this is a picture of Singapore, occupied Singapore. You have Japanese army officials over here, and one of the leading overseas Chinese entrepreneurs and political figures, Lim Boom King. And so the army creates this Overseas Chinese Association, and has Tui, who's a Han Taiwanese interpreter, cooperate and get Lim Boom King to recruit and get donations from the overseas Chinese community to then hand over to the army in Singapore. So this is an example of how on the ground Han Taiwanese are being used or useful, seen as useful in economic and political ways. The Japanese occupy the Philippines, they occupy Malaya, and there are just so many accounts available in war crimes trials accounts, as well as oral histories and memoirs of how cruel the Japanese were, right, toward British, Australian, New Zealand, American POWs. What rarely until recently it comes up is the role of non-Japanese, right? So there are several thousand Taiwanese prison guards who are sent to the Dutch East Indies, to New Guinea, to look after Allied POWs. And I've drawn on memoirs and oral histories of some of these surviving former Taiwanese POW prison guards. What's their experience, right? As recently as 2014, you have English language newspaper articles that come out about how former British and American Allied POWs talk about how the Koreans and Taiwanese were even more cruel. There were worse tormentors than their Japanese commanders. And we can talk about the various potential reasons. Is it abuse of power, taking out their colonized subjectivity onto the Allied POWs? Is it because if they didn't use corporal force, they would be punished by their superiors? It's pretty much all of these examples.
Sarah Kovner was on about a year ago.
Yes,
talking about this kind of very subject of from the Allied point of view, the confusion of who is who, and exactly. If you're a New York kid or a kid from Sydney, Australia, you have no idea who's Korean, Taiwanese, Japanese, Chinese at this point of the war. So I think some of it is even just misunderstanding of who the hell it is who's standing over you, let alone identifying which ones are the cruel one. It's you're malnourished. It's a highly stressful situation. So I think some of these legacies that we end up with are based on faulty memory in some ways.
So Sarah Kovner's book is excellent. She's a dear colleague of mine, and I draw a lot of on her work. She definitely has examples of Korean POWs, and her argument and point is to demystify this idea that the Japanese are inherently or essentially cruel. Exactly. But really, as you said, just when you have horrible logistics and lack of manpower, right, a lot of things can get chaotic. I will, however, say that the POWs do get to know their prison guards pretty well, and by the end identify them quite separately as Korean or Taiwanese, right. Precisely because most of their guards are not Japanese, and it's their commanders that are Japanese. And what happens, why there are several hundred Koreans and Taiwanese who are tried as war criminals after the war, is that British and Australians and Americans, they will point out and remember and testify against this prison guard or that prison guard and say, look, this was a Taiwanese person or that was a Korean one. To be fair, some Taiwanese and Koreans are let off because Allied POWs say, no, this prison guard was actually pretty kind to us, gave us extra food, gave us extra medicine. So, of course, these Taiwanese and Koreans, I don't think spoke much English, so you really wonder how they communicated. But I don't think the Allied POWs were unnecessarily cruel in their testimony. If they spent several days with a Taiwanese prison guard, they remembered pretty much how they were, treated by them.
I mean, it's in a way, in many ways, power, as indeed lack of power, bring about either a sympathetic nature or a cruel nature. It's not nationalistically divided. Yes. It's not like all the Taiwanese would be this kind of guard and all the Koreans would be this. It's as you're explaining, these various people with their various statuses are looking to establish their own place on that ladder, and that doesn't excuse or forgive cruelty if they're showing it, but you can kind of understand where they're trying to make a claim on this complicated hierarchy within this As I grew up, the comic books, it was just the Japanese. I had no idea there were all these other
Exactly.
ethnicities there as well. So I can, cruelty comes from individuals in some ways rather than just that lot because they are from a certain nation are inherently cruel or inherently compassionate. It's, as we're finding out, the devil is in the nuance and the detail.
And this is not to excuse it, but there's Japanese wartime propaganda. What's the propaganda? They are liberating Southeast Asia and Asia from the Western devils or Western, and so the Taiwanese, Chinese, Koreans are going to participate in positions of power, right? And a brotherhood of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And who's at the very bottom? The racist, white, Caucasian allied POWs. In fact, the Japanese, once they capture some of the top-ranking commanders, they parade them in Taiwan and the Korean capitals. I think there are some great scenes of this in Sarah Kovner's book, to precisely to show the Koreans and Taiwanese, look, we are now in positions of power.
Yeah.
The white POWs are at the bottom. So if you're Taiwanese and Korean and you internalize some of these values, well, you are going to start to see them as less than human, or below that of the Japanese or the Asians. And again, not to excuse it, but to try to show where that comes from. This is a picture of Indigenous Taiwanese volunteers. Now, this is no doubt a highly choreographed picture, but the propaganda and the official discourse. First of all, we have to talk about how horrible the discourse and rhetoric towards Indigenous Taiwanese were before this period. When the Chinese used the term Shengfan, or raw savages, in the 1800s to describe Indigenous or Aborigine Taiwanese, because they don't speak, they're illiterate in Chinese, or they're not assimilated to Chinese culture. The Japanese come in and they use the same characters to say Seiban, which means raw savages also, right? To say that they are the least assimilated, least civilized. So the word savage is used in English and in Japanese up through the 1930s. It's only in the 1940s where they need the loyalty, they need the manpower, where the Indigenous Taiwanese are now viewed as loyal, model patriots. And why would they be deployed to the Philippines or New Guinea? Well, commanders in Taiwan and in Southeast Asia believed, not incorrectly, that a lot of Indigenous Taiwanese had experience in mountainous jungle warfare. They could use their Aborigine or indigenous swords to help cut down trees, to make paths, or identify what was edible, what was not, and then also that their Indigenous Taiwanese languages were, because of the Austronesian affinities, they could pick up local indigenous languages throughout the Pacific. Right, so they enlist several thousand out of a population of 150,000 for these reasons, for the practical reasons of of the terrain, and then the shared Austronesian languages. And looking at testimonies by Japanese commanders as well as Indigenous Taiwanese, their language background really did help. Within a few months, many Austronesian Taiwanese were able to interpret between local tribal chiefs and the Japanese. And also Japanese and Han Taiwanese talk about how, they were dying from malaria, etc., but were ably rescued, or they were starving but helped out by their Indigenous Taiwanese colleagues. So this is a glorification, a celebration of Indigenous Taiwanese in Japan and in Taiwan. So this is a shift. Of course, it's not to say that Japanese treatment of Indigenous Taiwanese was at all benevolent, but this is a shift in the discourse. And there is a steep cost to the military service. Out of the estimated 200,000 Han and Indigenous Taiwanese who served in the military, you have over 10% or 30,000 who die in battle. And this picture is of a Indigenous Taiwanese battalion that is actually enlisted to a kamikaze attack of the Philippines. and obviously many of them die and do not come back. So I do not want anyone to come away from this presentation or from the book saying that this is an apology of Japanese imperialism. Even if I'm trying to show agency of Han and Indigenous Taiwanese, there's no doubt that they are in tragic and oftentimes cruel and horrible situations. So I'll try to wrap up and just try to show that, like, as Paul was saying, we have to look at hierarchies as ever shifting and really in the eye of the beholder, and which part of the empire you're in and when. Right? Within Japan, we know that there's a Japanese Han Indigenous Taiwanese ranking in terms of salary, education, official government positions, and those kind of opportunities. You go out beyond Taiwan, whether it's before the war or during the war, and these hierarchies, yes, remain. But below the Han and Indigenous Taiwanese are the ethnic Chinese, local Southeast Asians, and the Western allies. So there is skin in the game for these Han and Indigenous Taiwanese. If we were playing hypotheticals, if China was still occupied or these parts in Southeast Asia were still occupied, Japanese would be the official language. Han and Indigenous Taiwanese would be in positions of power, ostensibly through their linguistic and their higher status than the ones that they were colonizing or ruling. In the wartime period, the tragedy continues. Unfortunately, the Taiwanese who were mediating, interpreting between Japanese and Chinese or Westerners are now, even though they are now returned to China, they become Chinese nationals. They're the first targets of retaliation and revenge. So in South China, there are retaliatory attacks, violence by local Chinese. Many Taiwanese are sentenced as Han traitors. And then in Southeast Asia, you have, if we have the Nuremberg trials in Germany, we have the Tokyo war crimes trials in Japan. For the Class A, and of course, Sarah Kovner's book, Yuma Totani's book, Class A are about 25 to 28 Japanese top-ranking commanders that are sentenced to death, executed, or sentenced to life in prison. BC are so-called minor war crimes of those who executed or carried out torture, killing of POWs. And so there you have about 131 Taiwanese who are sentenced as BC war criminals. So, the wartime, and then the post-war aftermath is a really devastating and huge transition, not just for the Japanese. We talk about the Japanese and the atomic bombs, etc., but look at what else is going on in China, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia from the perspective of non-Japanese, and there's a whole range that we can learn from. So thanks so much for having me, Paul.
Well, it's been absolutely a masterclass, and we may bring up a couple more slides you've got as questions come in. But the first thing I'm thinking about is, again, seeing this from British lens, is that I was taught the history of the Japanese being obviously the enemy and the British being the good guys, so to speak. But how Japan treated its allies doesn't seem to be quite the word, but colony, as we saw, it's all about language, isn't it? They are allies, but they're also occupied, but it's also a colony. They're kind of willing, but they're treated different. It's a very nuanced understanding of how Japan was treating its near neighbors, I suppose, is interesting. So well, you've got high praise from Jonathan Parswell there, author of Shattered Swords, so he thinks it's great. That's fantastic. So the first question, I'll go back through a few. We'll do a few Q&A. So Ian Curry is asking, and it's a broad question that may need a bit of a explanation. But would the Korean experience be similar to that of the Taiwanese, or would you see them as being entirely separate?
No, it's a great question. And so I guess as a teaser in my introduction and also epilogue, I do talk about the comparative examples. Korea, is a larger colony economically and strategically. It is a more important colony with, about 3-4 times the population. So the number of Koreans that are playing a role in Northeast China is greater than that of Taiwan. Mm-hmm. but there are extreme parallels of their Korean soldiers, Korean laborers who are playing this intermediary role in both pre-war and wartime Asia. And you have Koreans who are participating on behalf of Japan, then end up ruling parts of North Korea or South Korea. In the case of North Korea, Kim Il Sung, he is an anti-Japanese activist, but many of the Park Chung-hee and the South Korean leaders were those who fought on behalf of Japan in Korea. The main difference, however, is that what's the difference between Koreans and then, for example, Indians in Hong Kong, Shanghai, who are working as policemen? None of them have the linguistic and ethnic ties that the Taiwanese do. So the Koreans cannot integrate and pretend to be Chinese or just seamlessly interface between Chinese and Japanese. So the ethnic linguistic aspect, that card, the Chinese card that the Taiwanese play, is not that in the case of Korea. Also, Koreans are allowed to volunteer as soldiers earlier than Taiwan. If Taiwan is 1942, Koreans are starting to be enlisted in 1938. Not because they have better Japanese, they have worse Japanese than the in terms of the percentage of population, but because the Koreans are seen as potentially more loyal and won't be pro-China. So the Chinese card plays this, double-edged sword where the Taiwanese can't be trusted precisely because they're too Chinese and so aren't allowed to enlist. So the Korean case is fascinating for the parallels as well as some of the stark differences.
Well, what a fantastic answer to that. So I think this will be a nice, easy one to answer, which is from another one from Ian, in fact. Were the Taiwanese troops easily recognizable by their uniform?
A great question. So in the cover, the interpreters have an armband, and the armband says, interpreter in Japanese character. Generally speaking, many of the civilian or interpreter class, they would wear a lighter color uniform, and they were not allowed to be armed. Same with nurses. So this opens a whole can of worms, but there are women involved. So I have examples in chapters 5 and 6 of Taiwanese nurse assistants where they are second class and assisting Japanese nurses, and they are wearing different colored nurse uniforms, right? The issue of comfort women, which gets so much play in China and Korea, deservedly so. There are also estimated a couple thousand Taiwanese comfort women, and they also tragically play into this hierarchy. Japanese comfort women are paid the most, then Koreans, then Han Taiwanese, then Chinese. So they do not have the same so-called privileges or wages, that you would say a male Taiwanese serviceman would have, but they are still placed within this ethnic imperial hierarchy, much like their male counterparts.
Well, again, a brilliant answer. So another one from Dr. Philip Blood this time. Is the Japanese experience incorporated in the Chiang Kai-shek Shrine in Taiwan?
Okay, it's a great question. So up until the 1980s, Japanese documents were taboo. You couldn't speak in Japanese. The one main narrative of the war and colonial Taiwan is what you would get in today's PRC. Japanese came and exploited, killed, cruel, oppressors. Either you were a resistor and heroic, or you were a collaborator and a traitor. Since the 1990s and 2000s, not Chiang Kai-shek's KMT, but the Independence Party, the Democratic People's Party, they have begun to write histories and then also incorporate memorials or exhibitions honoring Japanese colonial rule. Now, it's not they're not saying that Japanese colonial rule is all benevolent, but for the recent Taiwanese national identity, Japanese colonial rule, good and bad, is what differentiates them from China, right? So it's to say, look, a lot of the modern infrastructure, a lot of the education and technology came from Japan. Of course, it was for the Japanese, but the Taiwanese, what happened in post-war Taiwan, a lot of it built on this. So you didn't really have any pro-Japanese or neutral observations of this period under Chiang Kai-shek. It's really since the 1990s and since then. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Another fantastic answer. So, Rick Green, can we view Taiwan and Manchukuo as a contest between the Navy and Army over which doctrine would lead Japan's expansion?
That's a great question. So the a lot of the chapters are talking about the Army's push into Northeast China and Manchukuo, while the Navy and Taiwan government general are pushing south. One of the episodes in chapter 1 is called the 1900 Xiamen incident, where the Navy and Taiwan government general, they use the excuse of a Japanese and Taiwanese temple being blown up in Xiamen to occupy it. And they occupy it very briefly, but the army and then the Tokyo government says, well, we don't want to antagonize other powers. Let's withdraw. So in many ways, the army didn't want southern expansion while Taiwan and the Navy wanted to. So there are these push-pulls, and it's really not until the mid-1930s that the army is on board with southern expansion. Part of why the Taiwan government general has a lot of say in what's going on in South China is precisely because the army and foreign ministry, all of their attention is in the north, in Manchuria and North Korea and Korea, and they're delegating most of the responsibilities to Taiwan and South China, which the army feels is less important.
Brilliant. We'll do a few more questions, folks, and thank you for them all. And maybe we'll have another show in the future to deal with the second round of questions. But this one is an interesting one. So, did the Japanese army use more of the ethnic minorities compared to the Navy, or was it about the same between the two branches? Another really cool question.
Okay, that is a really excellent question. If I haven't looked at statistics, but it would be about the same. Now, the reason why the army, so if we're looking at Taiwan, the army allows Taiwan volunteer soldiers in 42 and the Navy in 43. The reasoning is that if you had a disloyal Taiwanese on a ship, right, on a naval ship or submarine, you could do a lot more damage than in the infantry. So in that sense, the Navy is more cautious. Yet in the end, both the Army and Navy are drawing equally and on Korean and Taiwanese, and there's not a preference among the two. They're taking what they can get.
Okay, brilliant. And this one, I think, potential large can of worms to open here, because we've talked about language, we've talked about nationality, status, past. We haven't really touched on religion yet, which could just see us off in multiple directions. But Jeff is asking, how did the Japanese occupiers react or relate to Buddhist religious practices, temples, and institutions of Formosans? I mean, so again, feel free to go as far as you want, but it could end up getting messy, this one.
Yes, it's a huge question. So to try to give you the short answer, really the Japanese themselves in Japan, it's a multi-religious society with state Shinto and Japanese but Chinese influenced Buddhism. So when the Japanese are taking over Taiwan, they allow Chinese Buddhism to be practiced. Now, state Shinto, meaning which is unique to Japan and not included in China or Taiwan, this gets ramped up from the outbreak of the war in 1937. The number of state Shinto shrines which people observe, praying and showing their loyalty to the emperor, like I think triples from 20 to 60 during the war, and that's where they start to ban the practicing of certain Chinese Buddhist rituals, so that you have a unified, just state Shinto centered, practice. But that really is the last 8 years of the war, and in terms of how it impacted, the war front, I'm not really, I can't really say. I will say that the other main, wartime policies besides religion and sort of promoting state Shinto was banning Chinese. So spoken and written Chinese was banned from 1937 onwards. Same with Korean, and only promoting the use of Japanese. So the use of Japanese, encouraging service in the military, encouraging Japanese religion. Those are the main sort of wartime policies. So
Okay.
religion would be part of that. Yeah.
Well, we'll just do two more, then we will bring things in. Otherwise, we'll just be here forever. But quick one from Trent Telenko there. How did the competition between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy play out with Japanese colonial administration of Taiwan? And feel free to kind of do a condensed version, because I feel that could be another show in its own right, I would imagine.
Okay, that's an excellent question. So the Navy is the one that pushed for the Japanese to take over Taiwan in 1895. Originally, the Army pushed for Manchuria, which they got from China and Taiwan. You have the triple intervention where the Russians, French, and Germans come in and force Japan to return Manchuria to China. So Navy is certainly much more into Taiwan, and they had been scouting out Taiwan since the 1870s, 1880s. That said, after Taiwan is taken over, the first couple governor generals are appointed from the army, and it's those governor generals who are pushing for expansion from Taiwan into South China. It's only after the taking of Korea in 1905 that the army starts to populate and play a bigger role in the leaders of the Korean colonial government and also Manchuria. So it's after 1905 that the army is pushing more towards Manchuria, northern expansion, and the 1910s and 20s where the Navy is really the main ally with Taiwan in the 20s and 30s.
Well, I think we will leave it there, because, I mean, it's been amazing. I mean, everyone's saying, invite him back. So I will invite you back. But just to kind of close, first thing I want to say is, I want to say thank you to you for doing the brilliant presentation, but I also want to thank the viewers for coming with some really amazing questions because, there's some thought going into this. And as I said at the beginning, it's not an area that a lot of people know a huge amount, although apparently my audience does know quite a lot about it, or at least it's encouraging to kind of ask things. I think, so I'm really gratified by that. But the second thing is, I kind of hinted at the beginning, I mean, I feel we're at the beginning of a kind of a revolution of understanding the Pacific War from these other points of view. Jonathan Marshall is watching, who's done shows with me, and he's working on his 1942 book. And we, again, I'm speaking as a Brit, we traditionally have viewed the war through very, very nationalistic lenses, and that's why we tackled El Alamein. We had South African guests and Australian guests, New Zealand guests, and I think the Pacific, it's the beginning of a new era. Do you agree with me that there's a lot more work to be done on not just the Sino-Japanese War, but the whole conflict, but from the voices of those basically who were there?
Yeah, no, definitely. I would say, there's exciting scholarship, Sarah Kovner and others who are looking at, Japanese occupations, what's the role of the Indonesians, the Filipinos, and really there's endless amounts where you can't talk about the Western Front or the Pacific Front without involving Western allies, the Japanese, and all of these Asian actors. So really appreciate you bringing me in, and also for the audience for fantastic questions.
Well, no, thank you. And I mean, minding you, when I've had people like Robert Lyman on talking about India and Burma, is that although there's the interest to understand the campaign, there just isn't the archival information. There just aren't the testimonies. There isn't the oral histories. It's the participants have all gone. I mean, I'm trying to find someone to talk about West African troops in World War II, and it's very hard. The years where the information could have been done, or that it should have been searched, they've passed us by. The people who participated have long since gone. But it's gratifying for you to explain there is stuff in existence in Taiwan and Japan and China to bring this study forward. And I think, to me, seeing the Pacific campaign through the lens of Taiwan actually helps us understand the greater campaign and look at the problems the Japanese faced. Again, I'm not excusing the Japanese for what they did, but just the problems of administration dealing with cultures and classifications and nationalities. So absolutely brilliant stuff. So just remind us again that the book is open source today, available, but also there's the hard copy is available with a discount code. So so the links in the description below, and folks. So I urge you. I think it's anyone who's watched this. Let's be honest, folks. It's a must get, isn't it? I know I throw lots of books your direction. You go, we can't buy them all, Paul. We haven't got the space. But this one, I think, is one to to shed light on the wider campaign. But what are your hopes for it? Beyond being read by the academic world, obviously you want it to be read wider and understood.
Yeah,
So what are your hopes?
It's a good question. In our American universities, you have such pressure to come out this one book to try to get tenure. Fortunately, there are resources to allow us to make it open access, so people in Asia, can read it. Hopefully, viewers in Europe and elsewhere can read it. But this is really one of the first times I'm addressing an audience that isn't an Asia specific, audience. Usually, of course, at my college, it's a very diverse group of New Yorkers, but I don't assume that people know anything about East Asia. So I try to talk, to give them background information. But the upcoming book talks generally are at institutions speaking to Chinese and Japanese historians. So it's very refreshing and nice to hear that, this can translate and it's understandable to others who are looking at the war in a global perspective.
Well, I believe Jonathan Parshall wants to make contact with you. He said we can talk to your department chair about the tenure thing. So Jonathan Parshall is a good guy to have on your side, something of a legend in Pacific and naval and everything else history is doing. So I'll get some contacts made between the two of you. But yeah, I mean, honestly, just fantastic stuff. And I'm really grateful that my audience is happy to come on board these journeys of discovery, because we know they like discussions about Arnhem and, Midway and the perennial favorites of World War II discussion. Stalingrad's coming up in the new year. But these subjects that are traditionally seen as more niche from some people's point of view are absolutely fascinating. And so I can't thank you enough. So I shall be ordering a copy and using my 40% discount. So it's been brilliant talking to you. So everyone's saying, come back whenever you can. So I'm thinking already of multiple subjects you could come and be part of, or be part of a panel discussion or something. But thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed talking to our viewers.
Okay, hope to see everyone again. Thank
Brilliant.
you.
We've got Rich Frank, everybody, tomorrow. That'll be another amazing show. So I'll see you all the same time tomorrow, folks. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying thank you very much for your time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.